What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the show. Today's guest is the Director of High Performance at Engage Sport North. I'm really excited to have him here today. He brings with him a wealth of knowledge and experience in the world of strength and conditioning and related fields. So I'm really excited to just be able to pick his brain for the next little bit here, hopefully find some tips and tricks and things that are going to help you unlock your potential. So, Simon Lamarche, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So I definitely butchered the last name. How do you pronounce it properly?
Oh, no, actually you did really well.
No?
It's, Simon Lamarche.
Oh, nice. I don't have the accent quite adjusted yet, but that's all right.
Just when people try it, it's cool.
I love it. So obviously you work with a lot of incredible athletes up at Engage Sport North with the university. And so today I want to tackle a couple of different fields, because obviously there's the element of athletes, but then there's also just kind of your everyday person who I want to have value for them. So we'll tackle both, but to start, with all the athletes you've worked with, when you look at the, let's call it the elite, the ones that are, the professional or able to make the jump, what's the main difference or differences you see between them and those ones that just don't quite get there?
I wouldn't point necessarily to like one thing that's different about all of them, but I would say like some just have incredible talent and just end up meeting the right people, being at the right place and having the right opportunity. I think opportunity is a big one. And then you just have some people who maybe aren't the most talented, but are just like workhorses. They just really, really know what they want, and they have this work ethic, and they're able to be consistent. And I think consistency is a huge thing that is overlooked. It doesn't really matter how hard or crazy you do something for 1 weekend, for 1 month. It's that consistency piece. So I think the environment plays a lot into it, being able to have an environment that fosters an area where you can be consistent, it's fun, it's enriching, you feel safe enough to try things. I think those things combined usually lead to some good results.
And so when you say talent, because obviously talent can sometimes be attributed to, kind of that idea of God-given talent, it's natural, it's genetics. What's that split that you've noticed between genetics versus working towards a specific level of athleticism or ability? Because obviously genetics plays a role, but is there a split that you've noticed? Is it 50-50? What role does genetics play in all of that?
I think that's a good question, because I think it really depends on what kind of research you're looking at. And the world of genetics is really complicated. I was reading a book recently where genetics is only one part of the story, because after there's a lot of different mechanisms and steps to actually get the proteins and different things like that. So I think that part is a little bit more complicated than we think from what I've read. And so I think we can't deny the genetics part, but I think there's a huge part of it that is just consistency over a long period of time. That again, though, I would put some caveat to that. I don't think it's straight cut for everything. So for instance, like anything that has to do with speed or like rate of force development, I do think there potentially is more of genetic gift there. I think you can still really train it, and that's one thing that I hear a lot from basketball players who want to jump higher, like, oh, it's genetic, like, there's not much I can do. But it's like, well, actually, have you considered this, and this, and have you actually like been consistent long enough, and have you pushed it to the end? But I think there's more. You can be more malleable if you want on the endurance side, and there's some really cool research. There was monozygotic twins, so that means that twins that are identical, not just born at the same time, and one of them was just kind of like your everyday person, whereas the other person was, had been training for a very long time consistently for triathlon. And when they did biopsies on them, the muscles presented completely differently. And so you would think like, oh, this is like a natural endurance, athlete, and this one is just kind of like your everyday Joe. And there was another really interesting paper I read recently, which they took muscle biopsies from elite cross-country skiers, and they kind of looked at their type 1 muscle fiber versus their type 2 muscle fiber. And what they looked was that actually the cross-country skiers who had more type 2 muscle fibers, when they looked at the amount of mitochondria they had and the amount of vascularization they have, so how much like like micro capillaries they had to bring oxygen. In terms of density, it was the same. And so, you think of an endurance athlete and you're like, oh, type 1 is good, they're going to be more endurant and can have a higher critical speed. But they were actually postulating that potentially, like for instance, like a sport like cross-country skiing, where now the speed is so high, the movement has to be very, very powerful and very, very quick. And so the reticulum sarcoplasmic, which releases calcium, and you need calcium for muscle contraction, is quicker at secreting the calcium and taking it back up. So I guess what I'm trying to get at with that study is that those athletes who maybe initially look like they would have less potential, they need more time to develop. But, this article was postulating that potentially they have more potential, but it takes them more time to get there. So I think, giving yourself just being patient and being curious. I see a lot of athletes, they'll do one type of training and they'll just kind of say like, oh, I'm not good at this. But it's like, well, there's a ton of ways to get to a goal. Like I've heard the expression, there's 1,000 ways to skin a cat kind of thing. Yeah. And with training, it's true. And I think that's why, it's important to give the athlete some autonomy, for the athlete to develop awareness and to journal what they do, to see what works and doesn't work for them. And then it gets exciting. But yeah.
So you talked a lot about this time horizon, almost like the idea that with time, you're more likely to achieve this higher level of performance. So would you say there's, I guess, a myth or not as much truth to the statements that, you get athletes all the time, especially in my coaching, I hear all the time, oh, I only need 3 weeks to get fit, or I only need a month to get fit. Talk a bit about that idea. Like, obviously, maybe you can say I could get fitter or more fit in 3 weeks or a month, but what is a realistic time horizon for somebody, regardless of where they're starting from, to say, okay, if you want to be considered, close to elite level of endurance, for example, what does a time horizon actually look like? What's a realistic number?
Oh, I think there's a lot of questions in that question, because if you're looking at like an elite performance, I think that takes years and years, because you look at things like economy and, just learning nutrition and learning how to change all your systems so that they become more efficient. But when we look at, say you're wanting to train your MNSS, which would be where you're recruiting to like most types of muscle fiber, and so there's a lot to it. I don't know how to explain that simply without going in a rabbit hole, but it's just kind of like your 1 hour speed.
So like your 1 hour, how hard you can go for 1 hour essentially.
Yeah. Like, so there's a type of training that's called threshold, which is, kind of medium high intensity. It's not all out, but you would do for a longer period of time, say like 10 minutes on, 1 minute recovery, and you do anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour of on time. What I've read is that, that takes about 8 weeks to train. And then you can have something called base training, which is your ability of your type 1 muscle fibers that are more endurant, if you want, to have more vascularization, more mitochondria. So to develop that, it takes, about 12 weeks plus. And you need quite a high frequency of it when you're developing, like 4 to 5 times a week. So when you're looking at a performance, if you put all these pieces together, it can be like a couple months.
Be a long time.
And sometimes, you kind of hear people like, oh yeah, I have a competition in 3 weeks. It's like, well, at this point, it's, maybe good for you to train, because maybe you'll fall in love with it. That's cool, yeah. But if you're looking at like really, really wanting to perform, I call that in the realm of spiritual at that point, the training.
Yeah, there's no, you better pray and hope, because there's no way.
Yeah, you can maybe test your equipment, your transitions, the food that works for you, but it's kind of like, a little bit too late. So I think, you have to be patient.
And you talk about all these different, like, almost, I guess, types of training. Like we've talked about the MNSS, is that what it was?
MNSS, so maximum lactate steady state. Okay. It's where you recruit, so you have different types of muscle, but it's where you recruit more than just one type of muscle. And it's where basically you can produce energy in a way that is sustainable. So that's why it's called maximum lactate steady state. It's a steady state because it's sustainable. When you pass that point, you kind of become like a time bomb. So it could be like 20 minutes if you pass it just a little bit. It could be 30 minutes depending on your muscle fiber composition and your training. But if you go like really over it, maybe it's like 30 seconds kind of thing. So,
okay.
Yeah.
And so when you train all these different levels, would you say that it's important for athletes across all types of sports to train these? Like, for example, a marathon runner is going to train differently than maybe a hockey player because it's a lot more of the short shift repetition type versus the long steady. How important is it to still train all the different levels of these different types of fitness if you're an athlete? Like, should a soccer player listening to this treat this differently than, a cross-country skier, than a marathon runner? Or is it, you still need to train all of them, but maybe just at different frequencies or for different time horizons or that sort of thing?
Yeah, again, I think there'll be different time frames for different athletes because you'll be wanting to emphasize different things. I think there's some things that some athletes should just completely avoid. That's something I teach. I try to teach anyways in sports school. I make this analogy with the different muscle fiber types. And so if you look at a sprinter, right? A sprinter will have a type of fiber that'll be like a crocodile. So I call it the crocodile muscle fiber. So think of a crocodile. It's been resting for about an hour. It goes, underwater, and it has like an attack that will last maybe like 6 seconds. So they're using a system that's very like phosphocreatine. So those people are very explosive. They're very, very fast. And then I make an analogy for the two other types of muscle fiber, and it's more complicated than that, but I try to simplify it with kind of a story a little bit. In that the most endurant muscle fiber would be like a deer. So, think of a deer. It's very red meat because it's very rich in iron. So, when you leave your bicycle outdoors and it's rusting, the rust is red because there's iron and oxygen binds to it. So that's why our blood is red, and that's why some muscle fibers are red, because they're better at transporting oxygen and using oxygen to produce energy. So I call those muscle fiber the gazelle. And then you have one that's like kind of in between, that is... can kind of go both ways, and I call those the wolf muscle fiber. And the idea with the wolf is that, you need a wolf pack to hunt a deer, because one wolf will get tired because they're not as endurant as the deer. So those muscle fibers are more powerful. They're closer to your crocodile, but they're not as endurant as the gazelle, at least, when you're untrained. So you have these three fiber types. And there's a principle called Henman's principle. So the Henman's principle explains simple things like, why is it that I can, lift a 50-pound dumbbell, but I can also lift a glass of water and I'm not like using the same force and smashing it into my face. So we have this way, and our nervous system has a way to moderate like the speed of contraction, but also the force of contraction. And it does so by recruiting a different amount of muscle fibers and different types of muscle fibers. So recruit like the gazelle muscle fibers first. So, if you think of all your like postural muscles, they're going to be more like gazelle muscle fibers because they're very fatigue resistant. Imagine if like your postural muscles were like crocodiles, like, oh yeah, you can stand straight for 6 seconds and then you're tired,
and then you
right?
just collapse.
Yeah, it wouldn't be very useful. So just to say that, like, the nervous system will kind of recruit more like the gazelle muscle fibers, if you want the analogy. And then as you either put more force or you put more power, which could just mean like running faster, you'll recruit like more the wolf. And then if you go like in a full sprint, then you'll be recruiting everything, including the crocodile. So if you're wanting to train a muscle fiber, you need to recruit it. And if we just go back to what I said, you need to have at least enough force or enough power to recruit it. And then it's a question of duration, right? So for instance, if you have speed athletes, I wouldn't recommend them to try and do something where they recruit like the crocodile, the wolf, and the gazelle muscle fibers for a very long time, because then those will become more like endurant, more aerobic, and they'll be losing some of that power component, some of that strength component that they'll want for their sport.
So by recruiting the other ones too frequently, you actually reduce the one that you want specific for your sport. Is that what we're getting?
Could be, yeah. So, for instance, like any kind of training of the crocodile muscle fibers or the wolf muscle fiber, if you want by analogy, they're always going to become more oxidative, so more indurant. So that's why, like, so for instance, 100-meter sprinter will need the longest taper. Taper is where you have a period where you reduce your training, you microdose it, you're just trying to maintain. And so we see in people who are actually like very, very deconditioned or even like bedridden, that they actually get more crocodile muscle fiber. So it depends what's the event. You know, you say it's more endurance. I think, yeah, you need to kind of keep some long, slow distance where you maybe are at the edge of nose breathing and you go for a long time, and then you do some threshold stuff where, you know, you go faster, so you're recruiting maybe the wolf and the gazelle muscle fiber. Like maybe you go 20 minutes on, 2-3 minutes off, you do that times 2, or 10 minutes on, 1 minute off, and you go times 3 to 6. But say I was like a speed athlete, that would be really not a good idea. Sure. You'd probably want to be doing more sprints and strength and plyometrics and things like that. That being said, you know, it depends. Then you have these athletes that are a bit of a hybrid. You know, people who need to have endurance but also need to sprint. And
so like a soccer player, for example, who has to be able to play for 90 minutes in a game, but you also have to be able to recover on a counterattack or join attack for a goal or something like that.
Yeah. And those athletes are very interesting because, you know, they still need to have the ability to accelerate very quick. They need to maintain their top speed technique and capabilities, because a lot of research points towards the fact that actually like reduces potential injuries. But they also need to be able to repeat that. And that's where it's a good idea, in my opinion anyways, to have a lot of like long, slow endurance training. So you're training their gazelle muscle fibers, but also where they have like a lot of decelerations, acceleration, so that they can build more capacity. And when they do that in game, they don't, or at least there's less chance that they'll get injured. And then it becomes like a very interesting puzzle, because you have some athletes that are more crocodile fiber type, then you have some that are more wolf fiber type, if you want, and you have some that are like your gazelles. And so I think that's when it becomes very interesting, because there's not a one size fit all in training, irrespective, in my opinion, of the sport.
Well, it's actually funny that you say that, because not always, not exclusively, but even these different types, right? So the crocodile, the gazelle, and the wolf, often you can actually see that almost present in like a player's position. For example, you know, if you have a winger, and in soccer, I'll use soccer just because it's my background, it's my nature. If you have a winger and you play an attacking type style football where you need a winger who's going to be quick and behind and then sprint recovery, they're likely going to be that player who has these types of traits. Otherwise, you know, if you have a winger who is maybe really high endurance but doesn't have the crocodile fiber, it's going to be tough for them to ever get past their defender, get a ball in and cross it. And then on the flip side, you know, it's kind of a stereotype, but midfielders tend to be the ones that they call the engines of the team. They're the ones that can run forever. They never change pace, but they're all up and down the pitch the whole game, 90 minutes, box to box. So I feel like there's almost some correlation to the type of fiber you have and the position you play in. At least soccer, and I imagine in other sports, is probably to some regard similar. Doesn't mean that you can't have a center midfielder who's also rapid. I just feel like your strengths with that type of speed and power and that you generate will help you excel in specific positions.
Yeah, I think so. You know, you have way more experience than I do in soccer, and I'm sure that there's some specificity to the positions, and that there's some people who are probably more talented at sprinting and end up in specific position. I also think, though, that with training, a lot can be done. So there's an interaction between, and I don't want to lose people into terms, but so just to make it simple, say like the ability to sprint for 30 seconds and your ability to maintain a fast pace for, say, 45 minutes. There's an interaction between the training that you would do for those two. And then we have something called VO2 max, which is your ability to use as much oxygen to produce energy. So say you train a lot, like your 30-second sprint. you will become more glycolytic. And so which means that your ability to maintain or sustain like your maximal effort for 45 minutes will actually go down.
Because so your body's getting more efficient at producing higher speed, but because of doing that, it's making it harder to do that for a sustained period of time. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's like you become more powerful, but I guess I don't want to talk about efficiency because there's economy and different things like that, but you start to so you have like different systems in your cells to produce energy, and you're starting to prioritize one that will have byproducts that don't cause fatigue but are associated with fatigue. And so if you don't increase VO2 max, your capacity to sustain a high pace for like say 45 minutes, an hour, 90 minutes will go down unless you increase VO2 max. And so it becomes very interesting because you see, so for instance, like in cross-country skiing, which is kind of my background, athletes who can sprint. And a sprint in cross-country skiing is a 3-minute event. And so it's not really a sprint. Yeah. But when they get close to the finish line, say they're like, they're in a group of 2 or 3 athletes racing, they really need to sprint. So it means that those people need to have a very high VO2 max, and that's how they can sustain having, a very high sprint or like a very high 30-second effort. But at the same time, those same athletes that are competing in that 3-minute effort, most of them will also be competing in, events that take like much longer, like we're talking close to an hour, sometimes even more, and they'll do very, very well. So I think having a high VO2 max allows you to have like a lot of sprint and have also a high capacity to sustain an effort for a long time. So
that VO2 max, in some ways, it's kind of the idea if you've just ran, you and somebody you're in a race and it's whatever, let's say it's a 3-minute long race. The person with a higher VO2 max, in theory, for that last 20 seconds or the last stretch might have a little bit more left in the tank to push. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, it could be, yeah. Again, it depends how the race and how the tactiques are taken, because say you have someone who has maybe like a high enough VO2 max, but don't really have like a very high sprint, like a 30-second sprint abilities kind of thing. Maybe they know that, but they have a very high, what we call critical speed or MNSS, so their ability to sustain a speed for like say an hour is very high. If they know that about them, they'll use a race tactique where like from the gun, they'll go very fast.
So they're trying to create enough distance that even somebody who can sprint for the last 30 seconds can't catch them because they're so far ahead.
They're trying to make it not a sprint, basically. Yeah. But if the person with a high VO2 max who has a high enough ability to sustain like a speed for an hour, but also has a sprint, well, it's in their advantage to just kind of try and draft that person and then sprint. So yeah, then when you look at races and when you look at games, it becomes really interesting because you can kind of tell like, oh yeah, okay, this person, like that's their strengths, that's their weaknesses. And then you start to read the game or the competition differently, and it gets really exciting.
That's where the tactics piece comes into the game. And
totally.
I love that. And that's a really nice transition to something that you had mentioned earlier that I kind of wanted to touch on, which is like, there's obviously the physiological fitness side of things. I mean, you take such a very kind of human mechanics, a scientific approach to it, which I think is great because it gives an explanation. It helps people understand what's happening inside your body from that standpoint. But what about up here? Because, we talk about all the time, we talk about football fitness, which is different than physiological fitness because it's how long does it take for your brain to fatigue? How long until that negative self-talk starts to creep in, like, oh, I can't push another one, versus the guy who says I can and I can. And, we had an athlete up at UMBC who was just an absolute freak at this, where he physiologically, he might not have actually been the fittest player, but his mental fitness was so high that he just was always testing off the charts. He was performing in games because of it. It was insane. So where do you see the mental side coming in, and how much can the mental push, not necessarily through the physical side, but like somebody who is physiologically more fit than me, how much does the mental side have an advantage over one or the other?
Yeah, I think quantifying that is pretty difficult.
For sure.
So I wouldn't want to put any numbers to it. But I would say, yeah, it does have a huge impact on performance for sure. Just like I mentioned at the beginning, the ability to be consistent. I think if you have someone who really enjoys the process. Someone who's not in there for ego, someone who's just there for mastery, and I think that person will be able to be more consistent and will be able to have better performance. I work with younger athletes too, and I work with a lot of female athletes, and unfortunately, I find there's a lot of perfectionism, and I don't feel like perfectionism really serves anyone right, because I think that it hinders them from actually trying and making mistakes. I think making mistakes is awesome as long as you learn from them. But then when you feel threatened to make a mistake, I think it doesn't really help people, because, when we see like leaps in the sport, it's someone bringing something new. And to bring something new, you got to try different things. So if you see things as a threat, I think that's a big hurdle for athletes. But if you see things as an opportunity, if you see things as, just potential, and you're supported in that, and you're supported to try different things, and you're not going to be threatened when you don't maybe deliver what you were hoping to deliver, I think that's when we'll get much, much better. And I think sometimes sport is taken a little bit too seriously too. I think it's important to become like very curious to sport and learn, and have a system and have awareness and different things like that. But at the same time, we're not saving lives here. But sometimes it's as if it's like we're going to war, and I don't think so. There's a book that I read some time ago, and I'm blanking who wrote it, but they were talking about these stages of an organization. There was like level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, and level 5. And level 5 was actually really cool, because even when players, and this was used with a lot of NBA athletes, and I think it was Phil Jackson, in his books, that I kind of saw the title of the book, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. So I went to the book. And level 5 is a lot about competing for the beauty of the sport. Like, not even seeing your opponent as like an opponent, but that they're a driving force to actually like push you and motivate you to make the sport better and make your performance better. And maybe it's utopic to think about it that way, but I think it's really cool to think about it that way, because I think it's a much more healthy approach. Often it's like, oh, let's go crush these guys. And then you get kind of like shame, and you get like self-esteem and ego in the mix. And those things are important, but I think it's, like we play sports because they're fun. We start them as a game and we enjoy it. But I think sometimes we lose that a little bit too much, and we take ourselves a little bit too seriously, and it becomes like who we are, not what we do. And then I think that becomes the issue. And then you see that in people's like personality and mentalities. And
definitely.
Yeah. So I don't know if that's the answer you're
looking for. No, that's brilliant. And I mean, honestly, listening to that snippet there, you could go into a rabbit hole for hours talking about it. And I love that you talked about, obviously, that ego and growth mindset, because it's something that that's actually the topic for my master's project that I'll be doing. Obviously, Steve, my mentor up at UMBC, it's what his entire master's was based around, and motivational climate and all these things. So it's something that I'm familiar with and that I really love, because I think it applies not just to sport, but to everything. That idea of that fear of failure, which is holding you back from trying new things, from pushing yourself, from being willing to fail. And ultimately, it's through the failures that we grow and learn and get better and better. And so by being scared to fail, you may never fail, but you're also never going to really succeed. You're never going to grow and never get better. And I think that's a tough thing for a lot of athletes, because as you said, it's almost like sometimes we put so much pressure on ourselves to perform and to get results that we either don't want to do it unless we know we can. And if we know we can, it probably means that we're actually not doing something that's challenging us, or we just choose not to do it altogether. And I think it can be stressful for athletes. It can be tough. I think back to a player like Ronaldinho, who is notorious for, he always had a smile on his face when he played football. Like any clips of him, you go look up highlights Ronaldinho, and he's got this smile on his face, and he's trying tricks, and fans love him. And I would say that he is not the exception, but he's actually the rule, because even though not everybody can have as much fun as he did playing, when players are performing their best, it's not often you see them with a frown on their face or straight-faced or really like it's not that they're not concentrated, but they almost hit that state of flow where they're just performing and they love it. And you can see that from the amateur to the top level athletes. And there are exceptions. I know I listened to a podcast recently that had Thierry Henry on it, and he said just because of the nature of his history and his childhood and all these things, when he played football, for him it was a business. He was always straight-faced, and he talked about it. The only time he wasn't was actually when he was assisting other players, and that goes into a whole backstory of him. But kind of the point I'm getting at is most players, when you are performing your best, it's because you're enjoying it. You're enjoying the process. You're not thinking about if I make a mistake, if I try this move, or if I don't make this shot. You're just thinking, oh, I love this. Let's try this. Let's try that. It works out. You smile. It doesn't work. You try again. And so I think being able to kind of let go of that side, the ego side of things, and just enjoy the process, love the game, it can help you get into that state of flow, which is then ultimately going to help you, succeed in whatever that is to you. And everybody has a different definition of success, but I think enjoyment has to be at the center of it. Otherwise, like you said, what's the point of doing this? If you don't enjoy it, then you better be making a whole lot of money to do it, because otherwise, really, there's no point in doing it.
Yeah, totally. And I like that you brought flow state in there, because that stuff is really cool. Because I think I had a teacher who described it in a way that I thought was beautiful in university, which was the delicious zone of uncertainty. It's like you're doing something that's not so difficult that you feel threatened and you're like, I'm definitely going to fail. But it's not something that you're like, oh, I'm definitely going to get this. You're like uncertain. And so then it gets exciting. And so then you bite on it and you just want to do it again and again and again. But I think the environment too that we create around athletes is so important. If you create an environment where people are celebrated for who they are as a person, not necessarily what they do, and for the effort they put into it, I think that's a huge win. So like a safe environment. So where the measure of success isn't necessarily like on performance. Because say you have, someone who's 14 who looks like a full grown person versus you have someone who's 14 who still looks like a kid, right? And we have that issue in sports of these people who develop early. We celebrate so much the performance, whereas maybe it'd be more helpful to actually celebrate the effort. And so in failing, sometimes you fail, quote unquote, but there was a lot of effort and there was a lot of learning. But then we don't necessarily celebrate that. And then too, sometimes we are rigid and then we don't allow athletes to actually find that delicious zone of uncertainty. We're like, no, you have to stick to this group. No, you have to stick to that group. So I think in creating an environment where people are challenged enough, but they're allowed to fail and they're rewarded for their effort, is really good. And I think that helps them to become more resilient and to have more of that toughness. Yeah. Yeah,
that's great. I mean, that reminded me a lot of again, another podcast I'd listened to, but it was something along the lines, and I might butcher it here, but the concept was celebrate before the final. And what they meant by that was don't go out and get sloshed and drunk before the final, because obviously you need to be able to perform. But it was the idea that if you've done everything you can up until that point, you've put in the work, you've put in the time, you've put in the effort, then ultimately, whether you win or lose the final shouldn't matter. You should celebrate the work you did. And then you go and you play your best, and whatever happens, happens. But I really like that concept because it's so true. We put all this pressure going up into the final game of a season, of a tournament. And then if you win, you're happy. And if you lose, you're so upset and you don't even want to think about it. But all the hours, the time, the memories, everything that's gone into building up to it should be celebrated. So that was just something that reminded me of that concept.
No, it's a really good point you make. Like, we're too focused about the results, and then we forget the process and we don't celebrate the process. Like, yeah, I like that. And maybe I'll start using that with athletes I coach. Like, hey, what place would you award yourself based on the work and the effort that you put into this before you get to the competition? Like, oh yeah, actually, I think this is like a bronze, or this is a gold level of effort that I put into preparing this for this. Because I think, we omit the effort, we omit the consistency and the work that went into preparing for an effort, and we only judge it based on the effort. But you can't control who's going to be at the effort, right? So focus on the controllables, and I mean, learn from the events. The event should just be a learning experience so that you know, what are my shortcomings, what are my strengths. And yeah, that's a really nice point you make.
Nice.
That's cool.
I love it. Awesome. So there's one topic that we haven't hit yet that I really want to, and it's the idea of recovery. So, and how important is it? Like, I know that there's so many different theories and research that you've seen, you should ice, you shouldn't ice, you should do this, you shouldn't do that. And I mean, I've done my own research on certain things. You saw my cold pod probably when you walked in today. It's on the balcony. I do a cold plunge every morning for multiple reasons. But what is your take on recovery? How important is it for an athlete to recover in terms of performance, in terms of injury prevention, and just a bit on what does that recovery look like to you?
Yeah, I think it's something that is starting to make more and more noise. Unfortunately, I think it's becoming a business. Like, recovery is becoming a big business. But the reason why we train, hopefully, is because we enjoy the process. But ultimately, we train to get adaptations so that we can improve. Say, if we're an athlete and that's what we're striving for, we're training to improve. And so when we improve, we're looking for adaptations. And we have this kind of mottos of it has to be difficult and you have to suffer and blah, 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 and more is better and harder is better and, blood, sweat, tears kind of thing. But we totally forget, like, hey, yeah, that's the input, that's the training. Okay, cool. So that's a stimulus for your body. But can your body handle that stimulus? Can your body actually recover and adapt? And then are you getting better? And that's a piece that I think we overlook. So, we'll see people like pushing super, super hard and being very, very tired and just slogging away. And it's like, well, yeah, it's probably not the best and probably you won't enjoy it. It's probably not good for your mental health.
So that's where we hit your like almost elements of overtraining or elements of pushing yourself beyond what your body's capable of at this point in time.
Yeah, overreaching, yeah, basically. And so I think that it's a balancing act between what is the input, what is the stimulus to the body, and then how do you recover so you get that adaptation. And I think the recovery, very simple things. Like, do you sleep enough? Do you sleep well? Do you eat frequently enough? Do you eat well? Do you have other things in your life? Are you monofocused, or do you have time to socialize and disconnect and have healthy social connections? And do you have downtime? Like, are you always on running around, or can you actually have some downtime? I think those are big things. I don't think they have to be super, super complicated. I think just, resting, eating, socializing, some downtime to recover. I think that goes a long way.
To what extent would you say that, like, I coach a bunch of athletes who say, oh yeah, I only need 4 hours of rest. My body, I'm good after 4 hours. Like, I imagine everybody has different levels of requirements for recovery, for sleep. Is there any type of baseline that you would say in terms of sleep or in terms of diet that would be good to follow, or is it really person to person basis?
Well, if it works for them, cool. I doubt it works though, to be honest. You look at when the world record was set for the 100-meter dash. What was that person doing 45 minutes before competing? Allegedly, they were having a 40-minute nap, so that their nervous system could be like more recovered and primed to go. I think, consistency around sleep too is a big one. People will say, I got 8 hours. That was great. Okay, well, you got 8 hours from 1 a.m. till, whatever. So being consistent around like bedtime, wake up time, having a routine so that you can actually like have some downtime before bed. And we hear this all the time, but we strive for like the ring or the this or the that's kind of sexy and we can consume or whatever. But just simple things like, hey, less TV time, less computer time, less screen time, like an hour before, maybe just having a shade lamp or something and reading or whatever, and yeah, having consistent, good quality sleep. I think that goes a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've gotten obsessed with the idea of sleep in the last couple months. Just listening to podcasts about it and education around it and things I'm learning. Like recently, one of the podcasts I listened to, they talked about how such a critical part of your sleep is as you said, routine. So it doesn't matter that you get 7 or 8 hours of sleep one night, but you went to bed at 1 and you woke up at 9, and then the next day you went to bed at 10 and you woke up at 6, and then the next day midnight. Like, it was actually basically the statement they were making was you're more likely to improve your quality of sleep if you have a routine, because we're as humans, we're creatures of habit. And so if your body starts to understand, oh, it's 10 o'clock, the lights are getting dimmed, I'm getting into bed, I'm starting to read, it's time to sleep. Eventually you get into this rhythm, right? And they talk about circadian rhythm, all these different things about how your body it wants to be efficient because it's made to keep you alive and as healthy as possible. But if you don't help it be efficient, it makes it really difficult on the body. So I think it makes sense. Like you said, to people who want to track their sleep and all these things, it's fantastic. But if you're not there yet, then maybe it's just something simple like, okay, start by just going to bed around the same time, and start by setting your alarm, and don't snooze it. Wake up, get up when it's supposed to, and force yourself into this routine, because I think without the routine, it becomes really hard to build that habit.
Yeah, and I think too, now people are a little bit more aware about sleep, and I think almost they feel threatened with like sleep. They're like, oh, I got a bad night of sleep, and they're like, oh, all these things are going to happen to me, it's going to be terrible, oh boy. Or when they want to build a routine, I think they're like expecting it to take like a day or two, and actually these things take time, right? Yeah, so I think the importance of a routine, the importance of being patient around these things, but also just being consistent, on the weekend, not being like, I'm going to sleep until 10. Instead, getting up, doing some stuff, and if you need to catch up on sleep, yeah, maybe having a nap, but like in the early afternoon kind of thing. But yeah, not getting too perfectionistic or like feeling threatened or feeling it has to be perfect to be good enough kind of thing.
Yeah, I think for the vast majority of people, it's, you might look at the high performing athletes, the best of the best, and they might have this rigid routine where everything's dialed in, but they need to because of certain demands. But I think for majority of the population, it's not about being perfect, it's just about being better.
Yeah, good enough so that they can be well and enjoy life and be able to bring their best game on whatever they do, whether it's being present with their kids or being present with their partner or at work, just being present in what they do. I think, just feeling well, I think is the goal.
I love that. Well, this is absolutely flown by. We're almost at the end of our time here. So we have this tradition basically on the podcast where we asked every guest that want 3 things that up until this point you feel have helped you in your life unlock your potential. Those 3 things can be, it can be anything. It doesn't have to be necessarily related to your work. It could be related to life, relationships, sports, anything you like. But 3 things that you would attribute to helping you unlock your potential up until this point in time. Person, place, thing, whatever it is.
I think my first answer is going to sound a little bit weird, but I'm dyslexic. And I think embracing that instead of as a crutch, as a gift, has been a huge help, because when you're dyslexic, you're going to make a lot of mistakes in school when you're young. And then, you kind of freak out about that a little bit. But then you kind of learn, like, hey, it's okay. Like, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. And I would say that actually became one of my biggest strengths, because, I read a lot of papers. I read a lot of books on topics like, academic books. And I don't think if I was dyslexic and had learned to fail and be okay with it, I would have been able to actually gone through all the things I've read and trying to understand and eventually understood. So I think, practicing failing and being okay with myself and just keep on going and just focus on the learning and like bit by bit getting better. I think that's a huge thing for me. Having the right tools would be a second one. So right now with Engage Sport North, we work with, we do analytics, so for testing and for performance. And so, we can have athletes come in, or we can have general population come in, and we're able to test and get a bunch of different metrics. So from their glycolytic power to VO2 max to MNSS to fat max, how much carbs they'll be using, how much fat they'll be using, how much lactate they could get rid of, or how much they could produce. So having the right tools, because just in the little bit that we've been using this, and I've been following this company that produces this analytics software now for a couple of years, I've learned tremendously. Like my learning curve has gone up exponentially. And so I think having the right tools is huge. The third thing I would say is just having really good coworkers and people around. So for instance, I have a coworker, he's a school teacher, but he works with me in delivering sports school, and he has really cool strengths, like his ability to communicate with people, his ability to make sure that when we're doing things, it's predictable for other people. He's very sensitive to like athletes and parents, and so I'm learning a lot from him. And then I also have like some good friends who are just super passionate, and I have one friend in Germany with who I have an article club, and he works for the analytics company, and so we have a question that we try to answer every 2 weeks.
Brilliant.
And we'll just like read different articles and debate, and but it's done in a very like curious way where we're not trying to one up each other ever. Like I find there's a lot of that in sport, unfortunately. It's just really about like sharing ideas and being curious. And so I have a couple of people like that around me, and I really, really value those people because they really help me grow. So I would say those are 3 things that really help.
Amazing. I love that. Well, Simone, thank you so much for your time today. So much knowledge, so much just insight into the world of being an athlete, and more than that, just being a person who wants to be healthy, be happy, and get better every day. So appreciate your time. Thanks for coming today. To everybody who tuned in, thank you so much. I will definitely be trying to implement some of these things in my life. I hope we found some snippets here that were useful to you, and hopefully this can help you unlock your potential. So we'll see you guys next time. Thanks. Simone, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.